Welcome to today's panel where we're talking about the role of philanthropy and liberatory leadership. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you all today. I'll just do a quick introduction myself and then pass it on to you. So my name is Ren Trueblood. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the development and data organizer at the Center for Third World Organizing. So I have been in a part of development, grant making, fundraising, grant writing for a few years now. And I'm excited to hear about your experience and your perspective. So I will pass it first to Danielle.
Hi, everyone. I use she, her pronouns. Good to be with you all. My relationship with philanthropy is quite complicated, but started off fundraising right here in the US, and then I was doing philanthropy and fundraising for international development organizations. And now I do consulting and grant writing, and so kind of all over the place. But yeah, it's great to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I will go ahead and pass it to Nikki then.
Hey, I'm Nikki, go by she, hers. I have been somebody who received foundation and philanthropic dollars. I've also been on the philanthropic side at a few foundations. I'm currently at an intermediary, like field building organization. So we do consulting to foundations, but we also work with movement leaders.
Thank you, Nikki. And then last but certainly not least, Ola, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ren. My name is Ola Osaze, and I use any pronouns. In terms of relationship to philanthropy, I currently work for a pooled fund and intermediary, and I've also worked with Nikki as part of a grant making table. That's a very participatory process. And prior to my current position at this pooled fund, which is Four Freedoms Fund, I was running an organization for queer Black migrants and did a lot of development, did a lot of just being on different grant making tables. So yeah, I have experience both as an organizer and doing that hustle for money, as well as now a funder.
Wow. So perspectives on both sides of the coin, which is great. So to get this conversation started, I mean, when we entered, we first even had a question mark about like liberatory leadership and philanthropy. How do those interact? So would love to hear maybe Nikki, if you wanted to share just like, since you were the one who named question mark, what you think of when you hear liberatory leadership and philanthropy. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I think just liberation and philanthropy is a hard like pair for me. So I'll just name that. I struggle with that. I think that oftentimes philanthropy is like 10, 20 years behind movements. And in that sense, if we're just as a movement, just getting to the edges of like how to be more in liberatory leadership, how to actually show up, like Erica said earlier, knowing our full selves, not having to show up with our full selves, but knowing our full selves in this work. I'm not sure how philanthropy can match that. But what I am sure of is that there are roles for philanthropy to play in funding and making sure that they're listening and learning with the field so that there is room for exploration and keep further momentum in the work that's being done right now. So I think there are roles to be played to interact with the liberatory leadership work, the liberatory practices that are being shared and learning right now. But I'm not quite sure if we're going to see like an amazing foundation that's like holds up liberatory work for us.
Yes, I think that thing you said, particularly about philanthropy being like 15 to 20 years behind movements, is so key in these relationships. And so I have two things. I see we have another person who has joined. We have just gotten started. And so if you would like to actually introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, and your relationship to philanthropy. I invite you to do that.
Thank you. Sorry, I was having tech difficulties and I got to hear everyone else's responses. So my name is Shan. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I came into my primary relationship to philanthropy was as a grant writer and an organizer for different social movement organizations, predominantly Black-led and women-led organizing groups. And then 2 years ago, I took on a role as the co-director of the Giving Project Network, which is a network of social justice funders. So they're all intermediaries and they all use the Giving Project model, which is a donor organizing and political education model. And so I'm kind of, we're all kind of bridging kind of 1 foot in movement, 1 foot kind of trying to shift philanthropy. And so that's where I'm situated now.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Did you say, correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Shan?
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, again, I'm here excited to hear about y'all's experiences, your perspectives, your visions for liberatory leadership in philanthropy. And wanted to ask if folks wanted to add on to this question around how you see philanthropy and liberatory leadership interacting. I know that Nikki had named some things already and wanted to see if Ola or Shan or Danielle, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we're having this conversation now because I just made the switch into philanthropy as a funder, about 5 months ago. So this is, on this side of it, it's a relatively new, chapter in my life and also in my work as part of a movement. And so I've been thinking a lot about this question of what is, liberation, and within the context of philanthropy, what is our role in, upholding liberatory practices and movements? What is the North Star around that? And so, yeah, I mean, I think for me, what's pretty critical is, at least in the short term, how is philanthropy operating that is different and that is really about flanking movements, especially movements that are using frames around, liberatory practices and visions, using abolitionist type of frames and lenses, centering BIPOC communities, queer and trans folks, migrants, undocumented migrants, disabled folks, like just really centering those who are at the margins of the margins. Like what is, how is philanthropy shifting really in relation to flanking those movements? And for me, it starts with, philanthropy needs to consist of people in those movements, right? It needs to consist of people who have the firsthand experience, who have both from the issue perspective and who understand what communities need and what strategies will get us there. And the way it's set up now, it's not that, it's set up where folks are not coming from, undocumented communities, for example, not coming from, communities that experience like all these multiple layers of oppression, right? So it's just like really privileged elite type of setup. And so this is nothing new, and we all know this, but it's just really remarkable as I'm seeing this reinforced over and over. And so for me, liberation and philanthropy, really embracing liberatory leadership, it needs to reflect the leadership of the field. It needs to be folks like me, more folks like me in philanthropy at the faucet where money is and opening that faucet so it flows even more, right? So that's where it starts for me. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for that.
I second everything that was just said and give a really big thumbs up. I agree fully. Love that.
Yes, I also second that, Danielle. Sorry to interrupt. So I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing that we got off to a little bit of an early start, even though the conversation is juicy and I want to continue this for sure. I'm wondering, since I believe attendees are entering now, if our panelists would be able to do another round of introductions. So just if you could share your name again, your pronouns, and your relationship to philanthropy. And I can model. My name is Ren Trueblood. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the development and data organizer at C2. And so my relationship to philanthropy has been one of being a grant writer, an organizational contact, building relationships with funders, but also really working to shift philanthropy towards liberatory leadership practices. So with that, I will pass it to Shan, if you'd like to start.
Thanks, Ren. My name is Shan Ofoilan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently the co-director of the Giving Project Network, which is a network of 9 social justice, community-based social justice foundations that are resourcing organizing. And they all use the Giving Project model, which is a model of donor organizing and political education. And I started with my relationship to philanthropy being really as a grant writer in movement organizations. And so kind of flipped over on kind of more on the other side, but still kind of like one foot in movement, one foot kind of trying to shift philanthropy. So glad to be here with you all. And I'll pass it to Ola.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here for this conversation. My name is Ola. I use any pronouns, and I am currently the Deputy Director of the Four Freedoms Fund, as well as the lead advisor for the Black Migrant Power Fund. And I also work with Nikki on another grant-making table called the California Families for Dignity Fund. So yeah, I have, it's a relatively new experience for me as far as being a funder. It's been about 5 months. Prior to that, I was, running, an organization called the Black LGBTQ Plus Migrant Project, or BLMP. So, prior to that, I was an organizer. And so I see myself as a different kind of organizer now in philanthropy. And so so I bring all of those different lenses to the work. And I'll pass it to Nikki.
Hey, Ola. Nikki, she, hers. I'm currently the co-executive director of Leadership Learning Community with Erica Stallings. And prior to this, I currently work with Ola too on a fund called the California Dignity for Family Funds. And prior to this, I was at a few foundations. And then prior to that, I was a grassroots legal aid attorney. And so I have inside and outside perspective of philanthropy. I'll pass it on to Danielle.
Hi, everybody. I'm Danielle. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently the co-founder within a collective of BIPOC folks here in Atlanta and the Southeast that work on a mutual aid fund. And it stemmed from COVID and it has expanded to kind of meet the needs of our folks in this current moment as well. Previously, I was in the fundraising philanthropy space within international development. And then before that, it was more nonprofit, local-based organizations that I helped raise funds for. So a quite complicated relationship with philanthropy, but excited to be here with y'all to talk about it all.
Yes, thank you all for introducing yourself again. I'm really excited to hear that all of you are people who have kind of had one foot in both worlds. I think that is such a special and important perspective to center in this conversation. And so I'm really excited to hear from you all. And when we were started early previously, we had kind of talked about what we even thought of when we heard philanthropy and liberatory leadership, like what first comes to our minds. And Ola, I think you were sharing some really great information. And I'm wondering if you could recap a little bit of what you were saying previously for our attendees.
I'll try my best. But really, for me, it's, just thinking about what role philanthropy has to play within this project of actualizing liberation. To me, it starts with who is in philanthropy in the first place, right? And needing for it to be more of folks who are directly impacted by issues, by experiences, folks who know what communities, especially communities living at the margins of the margins, right? So BIPOC communities, undocu communities, you know, queer and trans folks, disabled folks, poor folks, just, you know, folks who have the deep and layered experiences that we're all, you know, fighting to change. And so philanthropy really needs to reflect these movements, you know, and what I'm seeing, which is not something that I just realized, it's something that we've all known, but it's just remarkable to see it being reinforced, which is this kind of setup where philanthropy is made up of mostly of folks who are, you know, part of this elite kind of privileged group, right, who have no understanding of what experiences are, what people's experiences and issues are, and what even organizing and power building means, you know, and where resources should be, you know, devoted to relative to that. So for me, it's, you know, it's about philanthropy needs to be folks like us, you know, at the helm, more folks like us in philanthropy making these decisions about money and where money goes.
Thank you so much for that. Really laying out liberatory leadership and philanthropy as a place of centering the experiences, the actual people who need to be resourced the most. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to add on to that definition or wants to share more from their own perspective about liberatory leadership.
I can jump in. Totally agree with everything that Ola was saying. And I think one of the things that we do in giving projects when we start talking about philanthropy is actually talking about how as Black people, as Indigenous people, as working class people, like people have been moving resources, meeting community needs, you know, like mobilizing, you know, what, you know, the resources that need to happen to meet community needs forever. And that's been like a core practice of a lot of our communities that many of us come from. And that historically many movements, including the civil rights movement in a large part, were funded by working class communities that were, you know, and still disproportionately give away more of their money than the wealthiest people. So just to say that, like, I think kind of disrupting that of just like who gives money is like, actually it's working class people that are the most generous with moving resources toward you know, movements that are moving in their interests, and that institutional philanthropy as we know it was really developed by white capitalists that really were, you know, creating structures to move their money, keeping private control of their money, not paying taxes into like the common good, and using that as a source of power. There's a lot of, you know, histories of a lot of some of the major foundations that are really horrifying. So we don't have to get into all of that, and people can do their own like research on that. But I think one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of disrupt that and kind of reclaim that the practice of moving money does not belong to institutional philanthropy as we know it. And that, you know, I'm kind of on the flip side of what Ola was saying. I feel like I'm seeing more people like us who are grounded in movement, moving into positions of moving resources and having kind of positions of like kind of positional power in philanthropy to try to move as much money as possible to the front lines. And so I think, you know, just kind of trying to hold that tension of what the institutions were created for and what's possible when we can access those resources and move them to our communities.
Yeah, and if I can, I'd love to jump in. I think one of the things that we talk about with our mutual aid network, we take funding from a lot of different sources, and we tend to really think about what their relationship is to community before accepting funds, before engaging in a relationship. And so to Shan's point, I think for us and for me in particular, I definitely think that philanthropy itself needs to be critical about a power analysis that it does on itself. What is its relationship to the folks that are quote unquote receiving, you know, grants? So the grantees or beneficiaries, as some of them still call them. And so just really analyzing those kinds of power dynamics and choosing and also enacting ways in which you do disrupt that. I think liberatory leadership looks, the question when you asked it, I thought, well, what is it within philanthropy? I think it's also what is it within the dynamics of the relationship between the funder and the people who are being funded. And if we're thinking about liberatory relationships, that means that it's more of a flat structure, right? There should be no hoarding over. And so thinking about how those types of things come up in the relationship, how they come up in the granting, in the funding sources, and who we decide to fund, how we fund them. I think it really does start with relationships. It really does start with a power analysis, and it really does really start with thinking about things even in terms of, grantee and grantor, like that. Those types of things should be kind of thrown out if we're talking about liberation. So I just wanted to add those pieces to just round that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think you're all sharing so much right now. I'm hearing an analysis of power, a dismantling of hierarchy, a need to center people who are at the front lines of the injustices we're fighting against. We're also recognizing and dismantling white supremacy in grant making, because we know that those have been so deeply intertwined, and also acknowledging the ways that even though the elite, the 1%, hold so much wealth, it is actually the poor and working class people who give away more of their money, who actually engage so much in funding their own communities. So I'm so glad that we are grounded in that right now. And the next question I have is around who in philanthropy you all see is actually practicing liberatory grant making. And I think I've already heard some of you speak about your own experiences in that. And so would welcome that out to the entire panel. And maybe we can start with Nikki, since we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add, I still struggle with pairing liberatory work and philanthropy together in the traditional philanthropy sense. So I'm going to say, I want to name all these folks because I think they're really great folks who I've learned a lot from along the way. And they are moving philanthropic organizations. I'm not sure if they would also use the term liberatory, but I think it's very equitable for sure. I think Trish at the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, Ola at For Freedoms, Marissa at GSER, and then Ola and I work on a pooled collective fund called the California Dignity for Families Fund, which puts the movement leaders at the advisory committee level. So they're the ones also helping steer where the investments go. And so what I'm naming is there are a lot of folks of color who also come from movement, who are in these institutionalized spaces and trying to interrogate the process and systems that they are in right now and try to make it better. I'm not sure if, it's gonna we have some cool structures that are coming up, like trust-based philanthropy and some, other frameworks that are helping move the philanthropic field along. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure if a tax haven for rich families, a tax haven for corporations, all this wealth has been amassed through every single thing that we're working against. I'm not sure if it goes hand in hand with each other, but I think there are some really great people trying to move the needle.
Thank you for that, Nikki. And I think you're really naming the state of where philanthropy is at right now. So Ola, I didn't know if you wanted to add on. I thought I saw that you were ready to unmute maybe.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Nikki. And I think for me, it's really about, this community-centered approaches to grant making. And, I think about the Trans Justice Funding Project, as one really amazing example of grant making, because it's a number of things. It's very community led, right? Because it has, a grant making table that consists of organizers, trans non-binary, gender expansive organizers, who review a lot of proposals from folks across the country, and these proposals and the organizations or groups that this initiative funds is not just like the 501c3. It's like, formations that are not that. I mean, some formations that are that, but that's not the requirement, so it also allows for the emergence of, or it allows for the expansion of a movement, right? And also the more creative approaches to, trans justice and trans liberation, right? So, and then there's so many other things, also leadership development, project for the leaders who are part of the grant making, right? So that, they're leading their own organizations, and so they're still organizers, but now they have this insight into philanthropy that wasn't there before, right? So it also de-silos, philanthropy and the rest of the movement, So I just can't say enough about TJFP. And it's one of the inspirations for the fund that I co-founded at For Freedoms called the Black Migrant Power, which is, again, a community-led fund. It's 13 Black migrant organizations with budgets ranging from under 400K to, over $1 million, right? So it's trying to bring together a movement that's growing, that's emerging and growing, and also foster this community building in terms of how resources are, raised and diverted, right? And so I think a lot about TJFP as we build this Black Migrant Power Fund. It took several months for us to even raise the 4 million that we raised, which seems like it's an incredible feat. But when you think about how much money there is in philanthropy and how much in just for this, it's just eye-opening. So yeah, so for me, it's really about community-led process. It's like, let's really kind of build that in across the board. Let's center, the ways in which folks can, be part of, making decisions, helping to raise the money, making decisions, and helping to give out the money to the field. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm wondering, Shan or Danielle, if you want to add on to people in the field that you see practicing liberatory grant making. Also, if you want to dive into any specifics practices, I know folks have already named trust-based philanthropy, if anyone wants to break down what that means, and also talking, Ola, when you're naming moving out of silos, this is all really rich. And so I just want to dig in.
I can name a few folks, but beyond just naming, I think one of the things I admire, at least in this current philanthropic kind of season that we're in, is people kind of questioning their practices from the beginning all the way through, really taking into account what previous grantees have said, and so changing how they ask for reports or multi-year funding and unrestricted funding. So all those things that are simple and pretty much, I think, public knowledge at this point, like what grantees have said have been burdensome. I have enjoyed watching folks like people at the Children's Rights Innovation Fund who are putting young girls on their decision-making panel, and they are the ones making decision on what funding goes to girl-led activist movements throughout the world. I also obviously enjoy Thousand Currents and think that they do really great work. And have enjoyed watching, some folks like Calibri and Kotali Foundation and Borealis try to figure out how they take their, giant machine and try to, it's not perfect, but figure out ways to bring some equity into some of their practices little by little. And again, I think all of those adjustments, all of these kind of shifts that we're seeing in philanthropy, especially the big bucket philanthropy, not necessarily mutual aid groups or kind of, peer-to-peer kind of funding, but in these big buckets, I do think it's because, as has been stated, Black and Brown folks are in those spaces now, and they're listening and they're trying their best to kind of move the needle. Whether or not it's permanent, we'll see whether or not more power will be given up, we'll see. But for now, I think there are a lot of people questioning what philanthropy has done, the harm that it's caused, and the ways in which it's interesting what expertise is called expertise, right? Donors being experts and those in the front being called, needy, I guess. Like, so just really like having people in those spaces questioning that and asking for better. I think that's what we're seeing. I think that's the trend that's coming about, at least in my opinion. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say, just really resonating with this whole conversation, and just wanting to lift out, like, I think adding on to what Ola was saying about kind of community-centered needs, but also like the accountability and like really specific structures for accountability and decision-making. So like just all of the structures around participatory grant making, and where there's like just these, what feel like, I think can feel really small, but these ways of shifting power and decision-making around money is a significant thing of power. And I think thinking about what Nikki said earlier, it's like on the one hand, it's not that much money, you know, like the kinds of money that we're talking about, even like $4 million, like Ola said, is like, it's not that much in the scheme of things. And to me, I'm like, part of this is about building our collective capacity to move money in a principled way, in a values aligned way, in like a strategic way for movement building. And that we're just starting to kind of like get into that practice. And so there's like a need for like building capacity of like, how do you make those decisions? How do you do that in a democratic way? How do you do that with people that are most impacted? And so I think the Giving Project, I'll keep shouting out, because I think this model is really a really strong model for that practice. And that the funds that are running this model are all community-based social justice foundations. So they're all raising money at the same time that they're granting it out. And they're in this kind of intermediary place where they're kind of leading on the social justice values, and also kind of trying to hustle from the larger foundations to kind of, you know, have the relationships on the ground to be able to move the resources in particular communities. But those are groups like Crossroads Fund in Chicago, Social Justice Fund in the Northwest, here Foundation for Louisiana in Louisiana, North Star Fund in New York. There's a lot of different, Hawaii People's Fund in Hawaii. There's a lot of different organizations kind of in this community-based model. And I also wanted to lift up Resource Generation, which is an organization of young, wealthy people with class privilege. And they've made a commitment to fund like the movement for Black Lives. And I think they're moving about $100 million a year, just from their donor base or their membership base. So things like that are thinking of like different kinds of organizations that can move resources in a way that is politically clear and politically aligned, and kind of intervening on or just creating totally different institutions than the traditional philanthropy that we know is kind of slower to be able to adapt to some of these things, or will only adapt when, you know, unfortunately the killing of another Black person like causes another uprising, and then, you know, creates this opportunity where people, including corporations, all of a sudden feel like they have the space to say something, right? So, you know, where do we continue to support the movements that are making those kinds of ruptures possible, instead of waiting for those, you know, not trusting the organizations that are just waiting for that cover, you know.
Yes, absolutely. I think one thing that comes to mind for me when I think of like liberation and philanthropy is not having to be so much in a place of rapid response and like, oh, this terrible thing happened, so we need money now, but actually having long-term funding so people can build up their capacity, so movements can resource organizers and grow stronger, and not just have to depend on this terrible cycle of witnessing violence to Black and Brown people to make something happen, to make people care about it. So with that in mind, when we're talking about capacity building, I'm wondering if we can move to the next question, which is about the impact of liberatory philanthropic practices. So I think we've talked a lot about where we're at now. We're seeing that there are shifts across the field that are happening maybe more slowly than we would like, but they're in process. But would love for y'all to talk about the impact of what's possible when these practices are implemented. And again, if you want to get really specific from your experience, that is like so encouraged. So we'll just open up to anyone who wants to go there.
I can give kind of a recent example, and then maybe others. That'll give time for us to kind of gather. With the mutual aid group that we work with, we do fundraising, obviously, to get funds from community members, obviously, but then we also, speak to random, funders and folks who are politically aligned in the kind of wealth space. And one of the things that has been really helpful in a time of a major crisis in our community, where many of us, all of us, are volunteering while also watching members of our family be sick and not get cared for, eviction notices going out. It's just a lot of trauma. We had a lot of folks who were in kind of those traditional wealth, high net worth individuals say, here's the funding here. We'll send it to you via Zelle. We'll send it to you via some fast source, right? So that was one thing. So what was possible is to be able to move funding to those who are directly impacted immediately without signing a bunch of hundreds of contracts and sending a report and talking about our KPIs and all of that. It was very like, we trust you to be doing the work in your community. And it was very, it was one part like a very big bright light to say, oh, okay, so this is possible. Y'all just previously maybe didn't want to do it, right? So I think that was really, for me, that was one of the most affirming things, to watch folks pass, $50,000 a day within, over the course of a month. And we raised over $1 million just from individuals and other people, and having kind of these funders kind of come in and supplement that as well. And watching the money go out, people were able to save their houses and save their, be able to, buy food and groceries, which is what folks were really struggling with and what they continue to struggle with. And so I think what is possible and what it brings up for me, I think, is when folks can practice those liberatory ways, we can see our folks actually thrive, and at the very least survive things that are beyond their control. When systems of oppression come down on them from all different angles, there's a possibility that they have safety nets, right? And so that is one piece. Another piece is to also just witness how folks can kind of rally behind groups of folks, particularly inside of their communities. We didn't have to give out stories and do sob stories and lay out our pain. We were there. Like, I am here. I am actively telling you this is what's happening. You don't have to go to their house to see how bad it is, right? Like, so I'm telling you that to kind of be that space where people are in the midst of their trauma and not having to be in another form of vulnerability, right? And so I think it's one of those things where I feel like we work really hard to talk about wealth redistribution. We work really hard to talk about how systems of oppression work, and watching people kind of say, here's my responsibility to fellow people, even if it's not necessarily my community, and watching trust kind of unfold there. And so that's one of the ways I see the possibilities of this type of work. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a good question, and I feel like there's so many directions this could go in. Just a few examples. I'm just even thinking about one impact being, expanding movement, right? So just from the vantage point of, or just looking within immigrant rights or the migrant justice movement, years ago when I first came into migrant justice organizing as a queer and trans Nigerian migrant, and just trying to even talk about Black migration within the larger movement and how invisible. I mean, it's still the case, but it was a very different reality, like 10 years ago, for instance, in terms of, the centering, any kind of centering of Black migrant communities, right? And I think about an organization that existed here in New York for about 10 years. It was a queer African organization that existed for 10 years in the 90s and couldn't get any funding. We would, when I was part of it, we would just constantly hear, you're here, as an immigrant, you're here, so you're fine, right? And, and Black migrants not even being seen as needing any kind of support for organizing, for survival needs being met and so forth. And I think about the ways with over the years, the organizations that exist now, African communities together, Haitian Bridge Alliance, Black LGBTQ plus Migrant Project, so forth, have pushed philanthropy over the years to, approximate liberatory leadership, right? By putting money to expand the migrant justice sector for Black migrant communities to organize, right? For our sector to emerge and shape the movement. And where we are now is still, there's a lot to celebrate, and there's a lot to, there's still a long way to go, but where we are is still radically different, and in terms of the organizations that now exist compared to 10 years prior, where there were very few organizations, right? And there's still a long way to go. So I just think about it relative to, expanding the movement means that the missions that many of our abolitionist organizations, for instance, have, it means that those missions are more likely to be actualized, right? That, what the liberation that we are all fighting for, that is actually within reach if we're able to, grow the movement and center that movement leadership on those who are most impacted. So I think about that as one impact of liberatory leadership within philanthropy. I think about it also relative to just, how, grant making happens, from community centered to, what we even ask of people to submit as part of the application process, right? How money is giving out. I think about that as that shifting, right? Where it's not just like, having to prove, like organizations, the communities that are already dealing with so much having to prove that, yeah, not only do you deserve this money, but you know how to put it to use. Like, of course we know how to put this money to use. Of course we know how to put this, like really philanthropy, like if you really trace it back, it comes from, various indigenous communities. I'm including African indigenous communities in this in terms of the practice of putting resources together. So of course we know how to put this money to use. So I imagine that, another impact is like shifting that frame of how money is moved out into the field and who's part of it. So yeah, there's so many directions that, the responses could go right now.
Yeah, I love the direction that you took it in, like also really honoring the way that philanthropy has always existed in communities, that it's not just this field that like white people created in order to do good across like so many places that they colonized, and we're operating under imperialism. So thank you for that, Ola, taking it there. I'm wondering, Shan or Nikki, if you also have any experiences you want to talk about and seeing the impact of liberatory grant making.
I can go. Just trying to look for cues of like who's gonna go next. I think I think kind of piggybacking on what Danielle was saying about being able to see what's possible. I think for me is like a source of inspiration, and I think I see the liberatory philanthropic practice kind of like Nikki was saying, like I don't know if those words quite go together necessarily when we think about institutional philanthropy, but I think we're still in the practice of trying to like how do we reframe this around how we have already been moving resources, but just kind of like what's possible within like authentic and accountable relationship, and thinking about resources like the money as a really important resource, but also not the only one, right? And so thinking about like relationships and connections and those kinds of things. And I think that for us, like in the Giving Project model, we encourage like people do they do grassroots fundraising through one-on-ones, like through organizing one-on-ones. And so we're very clear that it's like you're organizing people and you're asking them for money, but it's both at the same time. It's not just about the money and it's not just about the conversation, but you're trying to move people. And that through those conversations, it just has a really transformative impact on people, and as well as people kind of coming to terms with their own levels of privilege and oppression and what they're able to donate. And so in the model, everybody, usually a group of 20 people, intentionally cross-race and cross-class, Every person is making their own meaningful gift into the collective pot and then also fundraising into the collective pot. And so over 6 months, this group is raising usually about $150,000 that they're then granting to organizing in their local community. And just, consistently we hear from people like, I didn't think that was possible. And I didn't know who these other people were. Like, I didn't think I could raise this much money. There's so much of just like being in that practice in community that shows that like, we can actually do this. We can actually we can move our political commitments in this particular way collectively and have an impact on like actually being able to move, these grants to organizations that aren't 501c3s or otherwise aren't getting funded or are new, right? Like all of the ones that are kind of harder to, have a harder time accessing the traditional philanthropy. So I just feel like, it's something in there of just like really being able to create like a material shift that that shows that a different kind of relationship to money is possible, a different kind of collective thing is possible when so many of us are like, our society is so steeped in individualism and alienation. And like, when we think about money, there's so much shame connected to it. So just like those moments of like personal, the kind of ripple of like personal and collective transformation through these actions of like trying to shift this paradigm, I think is a source of like, is a bright spot of what's possible. And I think there's, again, so much more to do as far as like being able to do that on a much larger scale with larger amounts of money. And that like, is uprooting and systemic, seeding alternatives and disrupting all of the kind of white supremacist, colonial, patriarchal system, capitalist system. But yeah, I think that it's really about, being able to practice what can be possible.
Yes, specifically that right there, like, I think for myself, even as somebody who has had to engage with philanthropy and especially in my earlier days was like, oh, I don't know what like levels of like quote unquote professionalism to maintain. What can I ask for? What's too much? Like, I'm really glad y'all shared specifics to really illustrate like you can ask for these things and have these needs met. Especially Danielle, when you were naming like getting funds immediately, that is so important and often feels so difficult in the philanthropy world. And so that brings me to our next question, which is where I want to ask y'all how you, if you're talking to organizers on the ground who are trying to secure funding from foundations, what kind of advice do you have for these folks to engage with philanthropy from a place of power, from a place of knowing like, these are my needs and this is what we need to have met? What advice would you give to folks?
I can jump on this one. I think first of all, like first thing we started doing at my organizations, we stopped calling ourselves the grantee of anybody. It's a legal relationship. It doesn't tell you the full story of it. And it's pretty like inaccurate too. So just changing how we talk about ourselves to others, like we'll be your partner, we'll help you be a thought partner, we'll help you, we'll show you how we do some things. But we're not going to be just in a subservient kind of position and call ourselves that. The other thing I would also name is if you're a nonprofit leader or a movement leader, that you should know yourself honestly. If you have some money trauma like me, you got to heal it or work on healing it. There's somebody named like Pescestani, who goes by the moniker Indigene Mama, who talks about money trauma, that so many of us are in this work because we came from poor families. We came from, backgrounds that serve like our communities and now we're here to serve our communities. And we have to heal some of that relationship with money in order to really get what we need out of this, philanthropy for our communities. You can also know some baseline things, like you should know who you're working with. There are like, where is the source of the money coming from? You could also know some baselines, like there are private foundations who are under a certain type of rule. There are intermediary foundations who act and function just like nonprofits have to. There are donor advised funds, there are individual donors, there are government agencies that have different criteria to them. You can learn all those things if you want, like to get some baseline. Boulderadvocacy.org is a good spot to get some like legal type of knowledge on it. It's helpful, not necessary. But if nothing else, I think there's one thing you should know is that you have more wisdom and information than the folks in philanthropy that you're working with. I think when I was in the nonprofit sector, I felt like, oh, they must know something else that I don't know, because ultimately they can make one decision that changed who I could serve. And that was it. It's like there must be some special rationale. And they also had power, obviously, with the money. So I kept thinking, like, they must know something. They must have like all this grant reporting that we've been writing. They must read it all. There must be some database. And then when I went to philanthropy, I was like, oh, no, that doesn't exist at all. There's another North Star that a lot of foundations go by, which is what their board sets up. And then you have to look at who their boards are. And then you realize it's not your people at all. And one of the foundations I was in, like, the board members made like $20,000 just to like sit on our board. And I was like, that's amazing. They should have put somebody who like just got to the point, like Danielle said, like if you just put somebody from the community in that space, you wouldn't have to do this whole like, intellectualizing like somebody's trauma to get to the place where you can give them money. So my point is, you should know that you know more than the foundations that you're working with. And in that way, you should also, because if you're in this field and you're a person of color particularly, or someone from other experiences, you probably are pretty connected and networked. You didn't just get here by yourself. You didn't get to a leadership position by just like, walking on your own island. So you already have a balcony view that we typically think that foundations have. So if we have all that already, then it's important for us to be honest about our wisdom and our knowledge here. And when we talk to philanthropy, we should know that we are actually bringing them along. And in that sense, you are a true partner to their work as well.
I don't know if we give snaps, but I would give snaps to Nikki, 100%. I do think the question of like, what should you do to be in the best position, all of those things. Yeah, it is about relationship. And again, it's about thinking about, even as someone who is quote unquote a grantee, we have internalized understandings of like how our power shows up, right? And so really getting clear about that from your perspective, as a potential partner to some of these institutional philanthropists. I think one of the things that I think is really important is to be upfront about your own political values, right? Your own political stance, and don't yield on that. Don't try to mold something different, because in the end, it could be harmful to the communities that you're serving. Many of the philanthropists who partner with folks on the front line, quote unquote, they're being legitimized through these organizations and through these community leaders. And so you actually have a lot of the advantage. Your expertise, your ability to connect is the reason that they're able to do any of the work that their boards are saying that they need to do. They can't have any impact without you. So I think from my perspective, I completely agree with Nikki. I think coming in from a place of partnership is probably the best way to go. And really just also being really critical about who you're willing to take money from. I think that's important. I think not all money, well, most money isn't, but not all money is good, right? And so being mindful of like what their expectations are around reporting and how much they're willing to be flexible and shift those practices. What have you learned from other, partnered organizations that you might know who've gotten funding from those folks? And so just really being mindful that you, as the folks who are in the community, you have more expertise, wisdom. Your placement is everything, and much can be highly more impactful than anything that they could provide otherwise. And so coming at it from a place of that, I think, is probably the best first way, because I think we do, because of the way the world works and because of capitalism, we would like to shift and mold ourselves into something else. And I actually don't think that serves our communities, doesn't serve the work, and definitely in the end won't produce the results that either side is probably looking for. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Danielle. I feel like you are really speaking so much to people that I've been in conversation with who really have been in a place of saying, like, our work is not very palatable to funders, and it's really hard for us to secure funding. And so how do we move from there? And so like, thank you for reiterating that, like, stand in your power, stand in your knowledge. I am wondering also if, Ola, I know before you were talking about Black migrant organizing as a very under-resourced field for so long. And I'm just thinking about that as being a field of organizing that wasn't very palatable to funders. And I'm wondering if you could speak from your experience about what that was like, and just being somebody who was trying to resource that field, like how, speaking from that perspective, to share with people how to like speak from a position of power with philanthropy when they know that oftentimes philanthropy doesn't want to fund their work.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I really appreciate what folks have been sharing as far as, stepping into your power, your expertise. That's another word that philanthropy likes to use, expertise. And your voice, and how powerful that is, and more than the program officer you're sitting across from. I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine last night who was like, founding a sex worker organizing project, and talking about how to be palatable to broad base of funders, and feeling nervous about that, and even that initial conversation. And and this is exactly what y'all said is what I said, is like, more. Like, you're the expert in that room. That person is learning from you. Like, they can't hold a candle to you as far as like what you're talking about, the issues, the strategy, like the trends, like you own that. You own that field, And so, and I think about, the Black migrant sector, and how, of course it's emerging, it's small relative to the immigrant rights sector. It's the, one of the more under-resourced part of the movement. And, as, when I was co-director at BLMP, Black LGBTQ+ Migrant Project, my orientation to philanthropy was, I need to, like basically, work with others to organize the field in order for even folks to even understand that Black people can be migrants in this country, right? Like I remember, we'd applied for a grant, and, I was getting this insider kind of perspective from one of the folks there who was an ally to, to my community, and who was like, yeah, it was a family fund. And the person, who was approving the grants basically approved every organization. This was for an immigration grant, approved every organization. We were the only Black organization that applied. Approved every other organization except for us. And they were like, yeah, Black people are not experiencing immigration issues to the extent that non-Black Latinx people are. And this was just a few years ago. So when I'm like, I'm not even talking like long time ago, right? So my orientation was like, I need to be, seeding, co-creating all the funder briefings, all the funder conferences. I need to be there, taking up space. I need to be a loud MF. And there are other people, within the Black migrant organizing spaces who were loud, and I need to join those voices, loud and saying just the very basic message of, we are here, we are growing in numbers, the conditions around Black majority conditions, Black majority countries fueling migration, those conditions are worsening. Criminalization, all of the ills that we were talking about is worsening in this country. And this is, this is in the time of Trump. There's executive order after executive order being handed down with Black people at the center of them, right? So we are dying, we are being caged, right? We need to be resourced. So that was like, my orientation to that was like, I need to be in every funder space, joining the echo as far as that message, right? And I think for me, that would be my advice to other folks who are in a similar predicament, is that, the funder allies or the funder relationships that you have, as few as they may be, like, they need to flank you by making sure that, they're holding those, invite you to a lunch at their foundation for you to talk about your organization, right? Reach out to give you a list of 5 other funders, and then do those introductions, right? have those conversations with the funders on your behalf. Like that's how they need to flank you. Like the few funders that you may know, right? Even if it was just one, right? It's not enough to give you the money. They need to make sure that they're opening up other doors for you. So that would be my advice, is like you step into your power as an organizer in the philanthropic space by pushing that one relationship you have to do more for you, because that's why they're there. That's why I'm here. I mean, I'm here as a funder to, again, open up the faucet, right? So yeah, it's you're trying to be in every space and using that one relationship you have to be everywhere and be loud. So that was my strategy, and that's what many of my comrades are doing as far as, with Black migrant organizing spaces. So
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think so much of like how fields continue to be under-resourced is because of this like isolation, this individualism, this, oh, well, that's your problem. My work's being funded, so why should I care about your work being funded? And so when you're able to build on those connections and those relationships and have people supporting you and fighting to make sure you're in the room and you're heard, that can shift so much. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And want to ask Shan, if you had anything you wanted to add on to this question of how folks can engage with philanthropy from a position of power.
So I had like a whole list of things to say, and literally everything else, everything was already said. I'm like, I have nothing original to contribute, but it's so refreshing to like not be the only person saying these things, So like, yeah, I just really appreciate being in this position. I think the one thing that I'll add maybe around power and around like being in the grant writing sucks. Like it's like really not a fun thing to do. I'm saying that because I have like 2 proposals and a report due next week that I'm just like, oh, I don't want to do this. But if you're good at it, I mean, it's a skill. Like I think there's something like I think that's clicked for me of just like being able to communicate powerfully and clearly and honestly about the work that's happening without like molding it to what you think they want to hear, and just like being really like communicating in that way, even if it's in writing. It is a skill, and it is a skill that actually, at least in my experience, is hard to find other people that like have the grounding in movement and can communicate, and have the skills to just like to do the kind of tedious stuff of like the grant applications and portals and all that stuff. But just to say like it is a skill, and like investing in building that capacity for yourself or for your organization is like, unfortunately, like it's worth it, like I think it is. I think there's something where going into this was like when I first started grant writing, it was like kind of, holding my nose and like, I don't want anything to do with the money side, you know what I mean? And then, but being trained by people who are like, that's our money. Like, this is a reparations issue. Like, where did they get that money from? Right? Like they got that money from exploiting our people and stealing our shit. Like that's ours. And this is about reclaiming that. And, so I think there's just something about being able to approach it from a position of power, and like not internalizing the scarcity, and knowing that there's tons of money out there and that we're entitled to it. And it's unfortunate that we have to be in these like ridiculous positions to try to like ask for it. But since we are, like, I think just really affirming what other folks were saying about like, what you're talking about. And like, this is an opportunity to advocate for your work, for your community, for where the resources need to go, and like educate people about how to think about these things. You know what I mean? Like be able to provide the political framing for like why this is important, so that they understand what's at stake and like why they should fund it. So I think that's just one thing. But yeah, all the other stuff about like relationships and like hustling, just like seeing it as getting what you need to get. I feel like there was one. Oh, I think there's something about like also being able to find a place in movement and in an organization or in a number of organizations where you can be fully committed. I think that for me, like, unfortunately, I spent time in organizations that only later I was like, I was not aligned with that place that I worked at, and so I think there is something about like things are shifting, and I think there is more openness to kind of more radical politics. And so then we get to kind of lead from that place and be really open about like being a socialist, or like what kind of vision we have for the future. And I think that there's been space opened up by movements that we get to keep trying to open up more space, kind of in the little ways that we can are in this position.
Yes, absolutely. You also are already leading into our next question. I don't even need to be here. You all are covering the transitions great. So we only have a few more minutes left till we open it up to questions. But I do want to ask y'all to name your visions for the future of liberatory leadership and philanthropy. Like, seeing liberatory leadership and philanthropy paired together, like, what is your vision for the future of this work? And so, Shan, if you want to go ahead and go there, since you already started talking about that, that'd be great.
All right, I can try to kick us off. So I'll say for the Giving Project Network, one of the things that I really love about it is that there's a really clear vision of, like, if we do our work right, these organizations won't exist anymore because movements will have the capacity to, bring in politically aligned donors and be able to organize resources to fund to move the work forward in a way that doesn't require all these, like, gatekeepers and intermediaries and all of this, like, kind of playing within the hierarchies, So I think that is one version of that vision. I think to me personally, I feel like, I am a socialist, and I think that there's something really important about the vision of having an economy that reproduces, like, human development and wellness and repair, that like reproduces, like, humans in balance with the earth and not, in, like, a non-extractive relationship with the earth. And I think that there's, that is about how we structure the economy. Not and all these other issues are obviously related, but, like, to be able to have a vision, not just of, what will schools look like in liberation, or what will specific kind of, what's a vision of ending specific kinds of oppression, but, like, below that is kind of like, what is the economy that produces all of the and reinforces all of these other oppressions. So I think there's something there for me about that part of this practice is about building our capacity to think about resources at a systemic level and think about the allocation of power at a systemic level, so that we can build our capacity to govern differently and to create systems that actually center community and center well-being. So that's the vision that I feel like I'm personally leading with.
I think I want to join Shan in her world. So I think big picture, I think we probably all have similar answers. Philanthropy in an institutional form probably won't exist. That's my biggest, that would be a joy. And I think from a perspective like mutual aid, I think it is one by which we reimagine what our possibilities are. We have come into a space where we're reciprocal and we have everything that we need, and that we're able to rest and thrive, and that people can be creative, and that people are allowed to feel safe in their homes, in their schools, and anywhere they go. And so for me, I think when I think about liberation and philanthropy, it's for philanthropy to give up power, to completely redistribute wealth without necessarily thinking about tax codes, et cetera, to redistribute land, because that is also a part of what I believe is important for the liberation of Black folks in general, and having land sovereignty and food sovereignty. So those are big picture visions. In the immediate future, I'd like to see some of these things that have become trends in philanthropy become standard. Multi-year giving, unrestricted giving, light reporting, all of those things will become something that's what everyone does. And that we pushed philanthropy to the edge, essentially, and the edge then becomes the center, right? So I think I think those are, like, my big picture visions for the world. Yeah.
I can go next. I struggle with this because I think it's really hard to tell an immortal and perpetual thing to have a succession plan for themselves. So I think in closer, like maybe in the next 5 or 10 years, I think what I'm hoping to see is that more philanthropists and people who work in foundations see their job as to shift their field so that multi-year grant making, general ops grant making can be more accessible and normalized. And that means that spending more time knowing their craft, like they have to know what is legally necessary, or when it's a carryover from corporate systems or from white supremacy powers or from colonial strategies, they have to really interrogate, like, why did we ask for this report? Because if you actually are giving out a general operating grant, you don't have to ask for a report at the end of the day. Like, there are just like some things just don't need to happen. And instead focus their time also on relationships with nonprofits, focus their time on having relationships with board members who are from movement spaces, instead of thinking that they are the holder of the balcony view only. And so like a lot of foundation staff, and I want to give them some grace too. Like if Ola shows up and he's your like foundation person, like, and can't be mad at Ola. Like if we are misstepping, like if I'm in my philanthropy role and I'm misstepping, I would love to be called in. But I don't want to, but you have to know, like, there's a lot of translation work that program staff level are doing to make it work out on that other side of the beast that they're dealing with. So there's a little bit of like, give some calling in, give some grace, but for the folks in those positions, be accountable, do your work, know your craft really well. If you're going to be in foundations, you can't be shy about it. You have to like know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and where the power is coming from. And that way you can be in right relationship with the movement leaders that you're working with.
Yeah, it's, snaps for all the responses. And it's just really inspiring hearing these different visions, which are, it's like one fabric, essentially. I'm thinking like in 5 years, I can only kind of think that near term as well. And I want to see, and particularly within immigration and immigrant rights, I want to see, more resources, more money being devoted to, Black-led organizing around immigration, to Indigenous-led organizing around immigration. I want to see the respectability politics within philanthropy diminish enough where sex worker organizing within immigration is highlighted. I want to see philanthropy take an even global, I'm talking about US-based philanthropy, take a global lens, not just, in terms of what's happening at the southern border and in Mexico, but even globally, more so than that, in terms of how can we work more upstream to address the root causes of forced migration that are worsening from, the wars and the various kind of U.S. interventions that are fueling that to, other types of interventions that are causing climate-based migration, right? So I want to see philanthropy really kind of double down on taking a global lens when it comes to resourcing organizing. I want to see more community-led, community-centered, entities within philanthropy. I'm so tired of this silo that upholds the powerful structures, and I totally hear that there's more of us who are coming into philanthropy now and who've been coming into it, and that's amazing. And I want to see more, just more community-led tables as far as grant making. There's just so much, that I want to see, but I just want to. In 5 years, I would love to be able to kind of boast about these things that haven't come to pass.
Yes, it can be really hard to look into like 10, 15, 20, 25 years in the future. So I also appreciate that grounding into like the next 5 years. It's very helpful. And I would also agree, like all these visions do seem so deeply connected. And at the heart of that, I see like the values of dismantling these hierarchies, eventually making it so foundations are out of business, we don't need them anymore, being the ultimate end goal. And so I am so glad to have been a part of this conversation and just heard from y'all's experiences and your wisdom. So now we are in a space of Q&A. So I'm going to open it up to our audience. If you have questions for our panel, to go ahead and drop those in the chat. And if you have a question that is for a specific panelist, that would be great to name that. Or you can also name if it's just a general one for the entire team to answer. making sure I'm looking at the right windows to see if there are any questions. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through right now, but I'm thinking also if there are more things that you folks want to be in conversation around, maybe questions will arise. I think particularly I would love to hear more about community fundraising and fundraising where organizations are coming together. So if someone on the panel would like to speak about that, that'd be great.
I mean, I can speak really quickly on the Dignity for Families Fund Advisory Council, or Advisory Committee rather, that I was still am actually on with Nikki. Nikki coordinates that space. And yeah, it's a space in which movement leaders, you know, again, this is within integration, are participating, as well as other funders. And actually, I really appreciate the fact that it's both, you know, organizers, advocates, and funders on this panel. And I've been appreciating, we've had some real talk moments. I mean, it's been, you know, it's almost a year, right? Is it over a year, Nikki? Yeah, we've had some real talk moments just in terms of, you know, because, you know, just talking about problematic dynamics within philanthropy, and, you know, who's actually doing the work, right? Because philanthropy has their darlings, right? I mean, you name the niche, and they're the, you know, and I'm seeing that, you know, now from the side, and I'm coming to terms with it with in a whole other kind of light. And so I think with this particular committee, the advisory committee, with you know, with this fund, we've had some real conversations about that, like checking those dynamics, both on the funder side and the movement side. And I've just appreciated the honesty and, you know, and the decision-making process. Like, you know, when we are voting, I hope this is okay for me to say, Nikki, when we were voting about each organization, it's like a 1 to 5 scale. And, you know, there, you know, I think it's 3 or so where, you know, it's like you're not 100%, but you're okay with it, right? So being able to kind of sit with complexity as far as decisions about who gets money, because organizations are not perfect, right? There's drama and there's baggage for various organizations, right? And those organizations may be doing really necessary work because no one else is, right? And so you got to give them money because no one else is doing that work, but you're also sitting with the fact that there's problems. So that, you know, it's, I just appreciate like the honesty we've had to have. And I think, to me, again, as I am like co-creating this other fund, the Black Migrant Power Fund, and we just gave our first grants and the consultants to form to really structure the community portion of it. I'm bringing these lessons of like, we need to be able to grapple with the complexity of what it means to really resource our communities at a deep level, what it really means to do that work. It's not kumbaya. It's, you know, what it means to work and make decisions together about money. It's not kumbaya. It's not that. It's hard, right? And so I feel like, you know, props to the way Nikki and GSERS held down that fund. I just wanted to, you know, give you all props. And that's just, you know, one example that comes to mind for me.
I'm going to piggyback on what Ola said, because like Ola is the only Black man on this fund, like in this advisory committee. And you know, it'd be hard to find another Black trans, you know, queer movement leader, you know, to be on a committee like this. So one thing that I really appreciated from this group coming together is early on recognizing that, all right, you're going to say it once, Ola, maybe you're going to say it twice, but the next time around, somebody else is going to stand in and say it too, you know, so you don't have to be the only representative of your community now in a year-long process together. There's something about solidarity in our grant making that we have to uphold. And it can only happen at the level where we have, you know, a collective at the table making decisions, but also diversity at the table that's willing to drop their institutional hats and come in also as like, you know, people in a shared interest now. So this is a pooled fund, which means that all these philanthropic folks from institutions coming in are not just one seat at the table and not the seat at the table. And like folks like Odelia, who is a Indigenous Chicana at the table. Whenever she talks, you hear her, and it's been a practice prior to this, but you'll hear her say like Indigenous and Black. You know, she'll never leave out the most underrepresented folks in this field, because that's the practice of solidarity that a lot of community organizers already hold. Now we're trying to bring it into the philanthropic space.
I want to jump in there because I think it's cool to hear. I think, yeah, kind of like get behind the veil and hear like how different processes are happening. But it also sounds really similar to the participatory grant making process in the Giving Project, which is not philanthropists, right? Like a lot of the people are organizers or directly affected, or in some cases work, you know, in a grantee organization or something like that. But they're just regular people in a community. But that when we're kind of preparing people to facilitate this program, we talk about that like we do all this political education on like race and class and all of these things about like bias and philanthropy. And then when the group actually gets to the grant making part, like that's when it all gets really real, you know, like you have to notice like what biases do you have when you're reading the application, or how are you talking about these things, or how are you weighting different things, and does that align with the values that we've all said we commit to, you know? So it's cool to hear that I mean, I don't know if it's cool, but it's like kind of reaffirming that same practice of how do you put solidarity in practice, and how do you put these values and social justice values and practices, you know, make them actually live in real life is a complicated thing that requires a level of like commitment and humility from people, regardless of their, you know, in any kind of decision-making position, and kind of taking, you know, kind of recognizing the power dynamics, and also that people are coming, you know, as full humans, and like being able to see each other and, you know, at that table in that way.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I think it really illustrates to me that no matter like what area of the work you go into, you have to lead with your values. And if solidarity isn't one of your values, you're not going to get very far. Because we're here trying to dismantle these hierarchies, and that it really requires these relationships. That's what I've heard over and over and over from y'all. It's like it is about relationships, and it's about changing ourselves and each other in those relationships as well. So I appreciate y'all sharing. Want to ask again, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if audience members have questions for our panelists. Okay, great. I see one here. So Zuri is asking, are there any resources you would recommend to get better at grant writing? And I believe this is open for the entire panel.
I don't have any resources, but I think practices that I have used in the past has actually been my mother. She is 84 years old. And so I sometimes ask her if this, you know, this organization, here's what they want to do, here's their mission, here's their thing. And if she's like, I don't understand what this means, then that helps me decipher whether this has like a little bit of, you know, maybe it's too many words, or maybe it's lingo that she doesn't understand. So just really getting clear, I think, is really hard. I think specifically for people who are perfectionists, it can be difficult. So a practice that I tend to use is looking at someone who maybe is outside of this work, or who sits in a different position, running ideas past them. And that helps, actually, for me, has helped me get very good at editing around what makes sense for this this audience versus another audience. And I would say one thing that has come up recently in some of the other spaces that I've worked in doing grant writing is to actually ask for feedback from folks who are in the space of funding. So if they deny, or even if they, accept your proposal, to say, what resonated, what didn't resonate, what could have been better, what wasn't explained. So those are just practices. I don't have actual, here's the book or platforms, but I'm sure others might have.
I feel a responsibility to respond because I think I was like, this is a skill. but I'm like, the trainings that I've been to actually, I feel like have been very much not aligned with what we've been talking about. So I don't know that I've been to a training, but I think that for me, a lot of it has just been in practice and been kind of like with people who I trust. Like sharing things with people and being like, does this make sense? Or being able to see, like I worked, I did grant writing for a little bit for BYP 100, and working with Charlene Carruthers, I think was just a huge, we didn't even work together that closely, but just seeing how powerfully she wrote about the work was like, oh, okay, like kind of gave me permission to, or like kind of made me step into, like, I also need to kind of communicate that clearly. But I would say that actually, like, one thing that I know when I've, like, just to find other people that are doing similar kinds of things and be able to like read each other's stuff and give each other feedback, like that feels like the most, for me at least, has been the biggest source of learning. And just like things about like getting the process, like I'm like, I always make a Google Doc to like copy and paste all the questions, and I always like keep track of the word count throughout the whole thing. And I always like, I do like a first pass of like dump all the content that I want to put, and then do like a second pass of like editing it to make sure it's like answering that specific question. So there's just things too about like kind of getting in a rhythm, because I think that, like, I would say that for me, every time I'm doing it, I'm like, there's all this rage. I have a lot of rage about it, about having to be in this position in the first place. So I think just like figuring out a process that holds space for that complexity, and give yourself enough time to like move through whatever process you have to move through and get support, and like not do it by yourself. So I feel like that's more on like a self-help level than like a skill set level. But I think that there are, there's probably a lot of skills as far as just like writing that are transferable from other kinds of trainings and stuff. But I think, I think the shared practice is probably the biggest thing I would say.
I'd also say that as a former reviewer of grants, people can be very nitpicky. And so what you write for one grant might not serve another. And so, sometimes it is a lot around like looking at the language folks use in their websites, or, what information they give, to see what language, do they say liberation, or do they say, I don't know, equity or something. So just things like that. Not that you should change your values or change what you believe, but you can get an understanding of where folks maybe framing are, or where they are in their political journey based off of what they've funded and also what they've written themselves. And so that's also been kind of helpful too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I was going to name also as somebody, reading in a lot of ways helps me get better at my writing. So thanks for naming that. Nikki, I saw you came off mute. Did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I have one thing. The California Dignity for Families Fund, like the bare minimum that we need to collect in order to get like a general op grant through, and even like a programmatic grant, you can just do like a paragraph, but you just need like somebody's EIN number, the contact, and like how to wire money to you. The proposal is extraneous. And what we did was we had a grant consultant come in and like just call up people, talk to them for like 30 minutes, did a whole review. But she also relied on folks like Ola to give her the real, like this is the balcony view I see. These are the people you should talk to. They're going to give you a fuller picture. And in that sense, because you have to do these due diligence conversations anyways, that already gives you the full story. You really, now the foundation, if you have to write up to your board to justify the grant or whatnot, you can still use those conversations, and you can use to write your own proposal. Write your own damn proposal. And that's my liberatory vision of how this can all play out in the future. Like this question wouldn't be necessary, and we can just rely on, folks on the ground and folks with knowledge to do it. And the foundation's work can be to hear it, take it in, and write the proposal to their board to like justify their work.
Can I just jump in really quickly on that? It's not how do you write, how do you get better at grant writing, which for me was just writing a lot of proposals, in addition to what, some of what y'all said. But I just really, it just really irks me that we are still in this place of the application process. Like Shan, just hearing you talk, and also me remembering like staying up to 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, looking at this proposal. All right, now this report, now this proposal. And then for like 5,000 there, 10,000 there, 2,500 here. And then it's just kind of like, it could just make it, make your head explode thinking about that. And thank goodness that there is a growing movement. It's not growing fast enough, in my opinion, but it's growing as far as doing away with these BS grant proposals that we have to do and thinking about ways, because it's similar for Freedoms and NEO, where actually you don't need all this stuff. What you really need is you need the 501c3 letter with the EIN. And then, the recommended is like, you get a budget, just so you get a sense of what they're working with and just for your own understanding, and that's what we implemented with the Black Migrant Power Fund. We just put out 1.3 million to 13 groups. And for that, it was like, give me your 501c3 and give me your budget. Done. And, and it's just, anyways, all that is to say is it's shifting a little bit. And hopefully in 5 years, it shifts even more significantly where you're not even gonna have to ask this question about how do you get better at grant writing, unless you wanna write grants. So that's a different thing.
You all are actually already on to another question that somebody had asked in the chat. So I'll name it out loud and see if you want to name more. So this Leader Spring said, I was a funder and grant maker for 14 years. We are not asking if grant writing is the best mechanism. We're very wed to this and we may need to file for separation or divorce. Is anyone having this conversation? So it sounds like some people are having this conversation. But yeah, if we're doing away with grant writing, what all do you see as like ways to sever that relationship?
I mean, what I heard earlier was that people are talking about coalitions. So it'd be great if foundations somehow created some form of a change coalition so they all knew what each other was doing. But I have definitely heard of a few organizations that I've worked with in the past. They do things like, instead of a grant, they just talk to you for 20 minutes. That's very common. I've also definitely, it's not the same as getting rid of a grant, but I've definitely heard people, I think it was, I can't remember the organization right now, but they were funding, they asked for a previous proposal that had already been submitted. So you didn't even have to change the name on it. I think there's other practices around if you just write what it's for, just the paragraph on what it's for, and then it's essentially 501c3 or whatever entity you are, just making sure that's clear. I think people are having this conversation. I do also think that from an institutional philanthropy perspective, it's hard because a lot of them are beholden to people or to groups like the board or the family or, XYZ other groups. So program officers don't want to read those 25 pages of grants, but their board requires it or et cetera. So it's really like for me, it seems like there needs to be more coalition building amongst these types of foundations and groups to really say like what we've heard from across the board from these, all of these grantees or all of these partners that we're working with on the ground, that this is burdensome and that they don't want to do it. And I think that could lead to having a shift in the kind of climate. I see it in one-off ways. I just haven't seen it kind of lifted up in kind of bigger organizing ways, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, I also have seen these like one-off situations. I'm very much a fan of just send us a report, you send to somebody else. That's great. Yeah, wondering, Shan or Nikki or Ola, if you have seen other practices or people having conversations around doing away with grant writing.
I mean, we're kind of grappling with it at For Freedoms. I think because we're a pooled fund, so, we have to, do that thing of what do our funders want? So there's that. And also our grantees need it to be less burdensome. And so we've talked about a number of things. This send-up proposal that you've submitted before has come up. What do we absolutely need? what can we do in a rapid response grant versus like, a general operating multi-year grant? What can we ask for rather? So we're actually getting into these questions right now for Freedoms is. So hopefully in a year, I'll have some more concrete answers from our perspective.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think the practices that Danielle shared, I feel like I've seen some of that. I will say that, okay, I do have something to add. That during COVID, I think there was a lot of like relaxing of requirements. I was just like, oh, there's the pandemic. We need to like get this money out the door. And so I think that that's another like one of those moments of like, it turns out like a totally different thing is possible. It turns out the government can just send people money and like we can stop driving places. Like it turns out that could happen. So I think I was just thinking about this for the Giving Project because I feel like one of the parts of the process is the panel, like being able to read people's applications, and that's part of their training on the grant making. So I was like, oh, I wonder what that would look like to like, and I think a lot of our funds are thinking about how to streamline it, how to make it less burdensome, how to do things like interviews or things like that instead of grant proposals, or how to do, we talk a lot about site visits actually, and that was one of the things that a lot of funders stopped doing. But I think for us, that's a really important space for the grant the people in the Giving Project who are making the decision about the grants to actually meet the groups and kind of break down that like funder organizer like binary. And so I think that's a place that we've had a lot of conversation too, is like, is it burdensome, or does it actually have some other value around deepening the relationship and a level of trust there? But I think that I actually just was starting to do a survey from a funder that was like, did writing the application help you get more clear about your work? And I was like, nope, it did not. Thanks for asking. But I think there is this idea that like, oh, if you have to articulate your strategies and we ask you all the right questions, it'll help you do your work better. And I'm like, being on the grant writing side, it definitely does not help at all. But I think part of the commitment that I try to have is like to make sure that the organization is developing our work plan and our strategy before we're asking for a grant, so that we're not like shaping our work around the grants. But anyway, yeah.
I just want to say that sounds so condescending. I don't even know what, it's so mean. Sorry.
Yeah, it seems very reinforcing that hierarchy of like, we're doing this to help you, but it's not actually helpful at all. So it looks like we have another question from Zuri for Danielle, specifically about the coalition you named, Danielle. Is this also the strategy to get foundations to do better and release the attachment to paperwork?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't know if it's the strategy, because coalitions are usually built on a shared, values and or some sort of motivation to be there, right? So I don't know how much individual foundations would benefit from coalition, but I think that if there was some form of it, that could be the way to move and shift power. And I would be the first to raise my hand to less paperwork. And so, yeah, I think it's a strategy. I don't know if it's the strategy, but I definitely think it could potentially be a place where we talk a lot about individual funders getting educated. We talk a lot about, partnership building, but we don't talk a lot about the industry itself, the system of philanthropy itself, as also needing to be organized into a different way. Folks who are doing this work from a very progressive standpoint versus those who are still kind of stuck in kind of a more conservative, traditional way. I think if those folks could get into the same space, it's potentially a way to have folks kind of hear what is possible, because their blinders are on, because they're stuck in whatever bubble they're in. So that would be definitely one version of a strategy.
Well, it looks like you already have people who are ready to sign up for this coalition, Danielle. I'm invested, I'm interested. I know at C2, we also are like, we see the need for philanthropy to change and we want it to change. So I think that's all the time we have today. I just want to appreciate y'all again. I feel like I learned so much from this conversation. just listening to you all, and I am so grateful to have been a part of it. So I guess if anyone wants to share any last words first or sign off, yeah, we're at the end of the session, and just thank you so much for being here.
I have a lot of gratitude for this group, but I also want to name like folks in philanthropy and folks who are doing work with philanthropy. I wish for you to know how to come back home to yourself. And that's something that Thich Thich Han talks about, like being in the beast itself is also hard. So I want to give you some grace, but also folks who are interacting and doing the work on the daily too. I hope for that for us to come back to ourselves and come back to some peace, because we're talking a lot about these big structural machines.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on gratitude. It's been really great to get to chat with all of you, and yeah, just really appreciate the not being alone in this, all the complexities of being in these kinds of positions.
Yeah, super grateful. Thanks for creating the space. Maybe we can come back in 5 years and talk about how our visions came true. Yeah, it was great meeting everyone and chatting, and I'm wishing everyone, rest and lightness.
I'm so grateful for this conversation and for y'all, all the wisdom and insights. I needed it actually. As a newbie on this side of things, I really needed the space. So I thank you so much for enriching and nourishing me right now. And yeah, let's keep on keeping on.
Yes, absolutely. I love the idea of coming back in 5 years and seeing what we accomplished. So it seems like there is a link in the chat to go back to the event schedule. I think we're one of the last panels, and now we're going into closing reflections. So yeah, really appreciate y'all so much again. Excited to rewatch this recording, because this is just really juicy, helpful knowledge that I think a lot of people are going to benefit from.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.